Hello.
Hello. Your turn.
Hi, everyone.
Yes.
Good afternoon. I have done for the paper.
Very good.
Close.
Lovely. I'll give you time to give me some criticism later. Should we wait a few minutes?
Oh yes, maybe
for the
just
others, yes?
1 minute, please.
No problem.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello. I have to apologize, Dr. Shannon. I'm Sharmata Tuli from Bangladesh. Actually, I am taking a session on stress management and yoga just within like half an hour in an university. So I'm getting ready, and I actually I don't know how to manage it. I'm going to take a class on stress management, and I'm like on stress totally. Join your class and go there. So I will be getting ready with the video off, and I won't be disturbing you when I'm leaving you. I'll give everyone a text that I'm leaving, and I'll do the recording class later. And I would love to have a talk with you later. And all the participants, this is the last class today, right? So
Yes.
I would love to be in touch with you. Maybe dear Sunghae will help about that. So yeah, it's been an honor, because this is the last class, 5th class. So it's an honor to be here and with all the participants here. So thank you. And Dr. Shannon, I really humbly apologize. I apologize everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
No problem, Shona. Thank you for letting us know. And yeah, I'd like to join your yoga stress management class as well, to be honest. Yeah, if you want to send me an email later, if you have any questions, that's fine. No problem.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuli.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you.
I'm here, but
Okay.
yeah. Okay.
All right. All right. So I think we should start. And okay. So I will start by introducing our lecturer today. So we have a very special lecturer, Dr. Alex Shannon, who is currently a principal lecturer in physical education and sports studies at University Brighton. He has studied and published numerous academic articles about martial arts on topics including violence, risk, gender, and media representation. He is also the co-founder of the Love Fighting Hate Violence and a member of the Special Advisory Group of UNESCO ICM. I'm sure that today's lecture, titled Understanding Nonviolent Martial Arts, How Practitioners Communicate Consent, will provide in-depth insights on anti-violence in martial arts. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Shannon.
Okay, thank you very much, Sung-hee, and lovely to meet you guys. Yeah, so the wonderful introduction, I won't need to add too much to that. Thank you very much for having me along. I would also like to say at the start, I'm really sorry that that my materials came to you quite late, but thank you for engaging with those. And of course, there's no need to have sort of read everything and answered all of those questions before today, but you can of course look at it afterwards, and we'll have a bit of time as I go through today to discuss your thoughts both on what I'm saying in the lecture, but also the questions that I sent out. If you did have a chance to look at those, we should be able to have an opportunity to talk through some of your thoughts. So yeah, as Sung-hee said, I've been studying martial arts academically for about 15 years now. My main interest initially was on gender and martial arts, particularly men and women training in the same environments, how their sort of gender ideals and gender identities became sometimes a bit of a problem, or other times enabled them to have good practices together. And then from there, I went and did different sort of projects that kind of eventually coalesced around the theme of violence in martial arts. Most importantly for us, oh, hello, Kate, just joined us. Hi.
Hi.
Nice to see you. So just introducing, just getting started. But yes, the little bit of background for the study that I'm presenting today is that after my initial interest in gender and martial arts, I became a lot more interested in themes around violence and risk-taking, and in particular, how practitioners of martial arts think about this idea that martial arts practice is violence. This is something that cropped up a few times in the studies that I was doing, both on my own, but also with my collaborator, Christopher Matthews, who I've published a lot with. Often martial artists would have a bit of a problem with this idea that the practice that they are engaged in is a form of violence, or that they themselves, because they do martial arts, must therefore be violent people. So this is kind of the backdrop for a lot of the research that I've done since starting my career, trying to figure out this relationship between practicing combat sports, learning martial arts techniques, and the idea that a person is or isn't violent. What is it that makes a person violent? What is it that makes an activity violent? So these are the kind of questions that really animated a lot of my research over the last sort of 10 years or so. Before I go any further, and before I start the actual topic for today, it'd be quite nice for me to just get a little bit of information about you guys, about who you are and what you do. So if it would be okay, if you don't mind just quickly introducing yourselves and giving me a little introduction to the martial arts that you do, and if you teach, like what kind of teaching you're engaged in, if that's okay. If we could start perhaps at the bottom of my list there, Kiran, could you go first?
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Mr. CHANNON. It's a pleasure to be among you all today for the last lesson. Myself, Kiran Mididin from Mauritius, a beautiful island in the Indian Ocean. For the last 15 years, I'm having a club where I give taekwondo training to kids. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Kate, could I ask you to go next?
Yeah, sure. My name is Kate, and I've been doing taekwondo for several years, and I'm also working in the association right now in Chinese Taipei. That's
Lovely,
it.
thank you very much. Thank you. Shemaima, if you're able to tell us.
Yes. I'm Shaima Akhtar Tuli from Bangladesh. I'm the first women black belt in Shotokan Karate from Bangladesh, and 5 times national champion. And this year, I became the first women veteran to play in an international competition in Las Vegas, America, and win bronze medal along with my son. I have a 19 years old son. And so both of us played there, and both of us won 3 bronzes. So it made a history in my country, because 45 to 59 years old, like that's veteran, no one ever played in national also. So internationally, yes. And I work with women and young kids. And I'm also Women's Secretary of Powerlifting Association and Gym Owners Association, and also Savate, like French kickboxing. So yes, I'm very pleasure to be here, to be with you and all the participants, lovely participants. Yes, yes, and I run my own fitness center for last 21 years. Okay. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shemaima. Sounds like you've got an awful lot of things going on, so no surprise that you have to go today, but thank you very much. And Ranhui, if I'm saying your name right.
Okay, good afternoon, Professor Alex. I am Ren Hui. I come from China, and I'm 27 years old. Currently, I am a university teacher, and the school I'm teaching is located in Anhui province in China. And the ages of my students, they are from 18 years old to 23 years old. Okay, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. And Yongwoo, welcome. Nice to see you. If you'd be able to introduce yourself briefly. Yongwoo, can you hear us? Lee? Perhaps not. Okay, never mind. We'll go forward. So, yeah, lovely to meet you all, and thank you very much for coming along and yeah, being part of this, and for thank you to ICM again for having me along to talk about my work, and hopefully give you guys something interesting to think about for your both for your professional practice, but also for your participation in the MARI program. So, as I was saying just before we did the introductions, I'm very interested in this idea of the way that martial artists think about violence. And one of the projects that I've been involved in, which I'll say a little bit more about later, and we can spend a bit of time on if people would like to, is this project which Sung-hee introduced a moment ago, which is called Love Fighting Hate Violence. And the Love Fighting Hate Violence project is something that myself and Christopher Matthews developed as a way to teach young people about violence and how to be non-violent through the medium of martial arts activities. The reason that we developed this program was that as we were researching martial arts and violence, it became increasingly clear to us that people who practice martial arts believed that martial arts weren't violent, or at least weren't, real violence, as many of our interviewees told us, in ways that highlighted the importance of consent in determining what is and isn't a violent action. So the way that we thought about violence was, rather than seeing violence as an objective act, that violence happens when one person punches another, or when somebody throws somebody else on the floor. The violence isn't necessarily the action, but the violence is the meaning of the action. So what I mean by that is, in a boxing context, if we're practicing boxing, we're sparring, when I punch my partner, the partner doesn't experience that punch as a form of violence. They don't experience it as something which violates them. They don't feel that it's something which is destructive, which is oppressive, something which I'm intending to use to harm or to dominate them. They actually experience it as something quite positive. My punch is something that they actually want to happen to them. This is something that I mentioned my first research project on gender in martial arts. When men and women training together in different martial arts contexts, one of the things that crops up quite often is that, for instance, men feel hesitant or uncomfortable with hitting women with any kind of degree of force or power. And some of the women that I interviewed who were competitive kickboxers, they really didn't like this because they weren't getting proper training in their eyes. When they trained with men, they weren't getting the benefit of learning what it really feels like to be hit, which they needed if they wanted to be competitive athletes. So this kind of brings us back to the idea that when we're training together, whether gender is part of this equation or it isn't, we actually want our training partners, our sparring partners, our opponents, even in competition, we want them to hit us. We want them to try their best to beat us, which is completely different to the kind of action that happens outside of martial arts, generally, when people punch and kick and throw each other onto the floor. So the same action could be committed between the same people in a martial arts context and experienced as very positive, as mutually supportive and constructive and beneficial. And that same action could be done between the same people on the streets, outside of martial arts, in a context where it's experienced as damaging and as oppressive and as something which is intended to harm. So the difference between these two things isn't the objective action. It's not the punch itself that becomes violence, that begets a violent interaction. The difference is the relationship that exists between the people involved. So when somebody punches me in a martial arts context, I like it. I'm happy with that. I want that to happen. When somebody punches me outside, I absolutely don't. And the relationship that exists between me as the person who was punched and the other person doing the punching is clearly very, very different. So the first sort of main point to make, a sort of broad theoretical point to make, is that the backdrop to all of this research that we've done on consent is that we think about violence as being defined around the presence or the absence of consent. Certainly in martial arts contexts, the consensual nature of the relationships in martial arts, whether that be in training, whether it be in competition, the consensual nature of that practice means that the relationships between people involved are not characterized by violence. The same actions could be committed by the same people without consent, and they would be experienced as violence. They'd be experienced as something negative and destructive. So this is something that we've, Christopher Matthews and I have published a few different articles on. If you're interested in reading a bit more around this basic, philosophical difference and the sociological theory that underpins it, I'm not going to go into too much detail on that today. But if you do want to sort of learn a bit more about that, I'm happy to take questions on it later, or of course to direct you to some reading material as well to get into the sort of the meat of that argument. But that's kind of the backdrop to what I want to talk about today. So that's the theory. We also had this love fighting, hate violence program where we felt that because martial artists are, so sort of attuned to this importance of consensual practice, that this is very important philosophically, it's very important, sort of morally and ethically in martial arts. Perhaps we can use martial arts as a way to teach young people about violence and about, importantly, consent. A lot of the time when young people learn about consent, particularly in the UK, they're taught about consent usually in the context of sexual consent, and usually they're taught about it in fairly boring and dry ways where they're just sort of told, this is what consent is, you must do this, you must do that, and you must not do this. What we felt we could do is we could develop a martial arts program where we can get young people and teenagers to run around, punch bags, maybe punch each other a little bit, and have like the fun of doing physical activity, which I'm sure as martial artists and instructors we all understand, to make this a bit more interesting and make it a bit more of an engaging way to learn about what consent feels like when you're being punched and kicked. So that's kind of the sort of practical work that I was involved in. Since about 2016, we started to do this project, Love Fighting, Hate Violence. And all of this brings me to what I want to actually talk about today, which is consent as a social practice. What we realized was missing from the research, the philosophy and the practical application of that we developed was a really good understanding of how consent actually happens in martial arts practice. So let me skip forward into my prezi here. If consent is so important, it's so important in martial arts practice generally, it's so important in sports wider than martial arts. So, the reason that athletes don't get arrested for tackling each other or, in combat sports for kicking each other is because of the legal principle of consent. That's a pretty well established legal norm in the UK, for instance, that you wouldn't be, if somebody tackled somebody in a rugby match, if somebody kicked somebody in a kickboxing match, they're not going to be treated as criminals. It's not going to be treated as assault because of the assumption that there's a consensual relationship that's going on. So legally, this is very important for sports. Morally, as I mentioned with respect to my research, it's very important for martial artists. They say, this is, the reason that I feel like I'm not a violent person usually comes down to this idea of consent. In my field, my academic discipline, the sociology of sport, this really hasn't been researched very much. So we have a lot of research on consent in the sociology of medicine, in the sociology of sex and gender studies. There's some very good, fairly well-established bodies of research that shows how consent gets done in these fields, and gives us a way to understand what consent means in practice. But there's virtually no research in the sociology of sport. So that's where this research comes in. That's where the paper that I've shared with you comes in. It's our attempt to try and fill that gap and give us some understanding of what consent looks like in sport settings. So what I'm going to do for the rest of today's presentation is talk about these 3 points down at the bottom here, how consent is understood, but most importantly, how consent is constructed and how it's communicated in martial arts settings. So what do people who practice martial arts do to indicate to each other that they consent to being punched, or that they consent to being, thrown around and kicked and so on? So how does that get worked out in practice? This is very important in martial arts. So how is it actually done between people? A little bit more, just very brief background. I won't spend too long on this. In the rest of the research literature that deals with consent in sport, there is some research, I should say, it's not completely missing from the research literature, if you guys are interested in reading more around this. But generally, consent doesn't get studied as an object itself. It gets sort of assumed as either people do or don't consent to something, and that's all we really do. That's all the attention we pay to it, not necessarily much attention to how consent is worked out in practice. There is, of course, some research on sexual consent in sport, which, for those of you who are involved in your national governing bodies, you'll probably be aware of fairly high-profile sex abuse scandals that crop up in the media from time to time, where athletes perhaps have been exploited or abused by their coaches. That has been fairly well researched by people in my field, but again, this is about sexual consent. It's not about consent to do sports per se. So, as I say, it's fairly under-researched area, fairly under-researched topic, which is always exciting for someone like myself as an academic, because we like to do research on things that haven't been researched yet. I will say one more thing on this, though, that's just to draw to your attention that this book, if you're really interested in this topic, I would absolutely recommend this book. It's the only example that I'm aware of a study that looks at consent in combat sports, outside of my work, of course, by Jill Weinberg. It's a study based in the USA on mixed martial arts athletes. And Weinberg does a comparative study between the practices of consent that go on in mixed martial arts and BDSM, so sadomasochism communities. So not sporting, but a group of sort of a subculture which exists in a similar cultural space, a kind of marginalized, sometimes quite stigmatized group of people who have to have a fairly good understanding of consent for their practices. So it's a very interesting text. It's not a particularly long book, and it's something that you might find interesting on this topic. So that's a broad bit of background on the sort of the research question that I'm looking at today, how we think about the importance of consent, which informed the research which I'm going to present to you as we move through. At this point, I think it's probably worth just pausing for a moment and flicking to the questions that I sent you guys beforehand. Absolutely no pressure to participate if you haven't managed to look at these yet. That's my fault for sending them quite late. But at this point, I think the first question might be useful for us to have a quick reflection on. So, what does giving consent mean to you, both personally, but also in your own martial arts practice? What does consent sort of mean in these contexts? Is it something that you talk about much with your participants, with your students that you train? Is it something that you have even thought about yourselves, about the importance of giving consent to be punched and to be kicked in martial arts context? So I'll just put it open to the floor. I won't ask anybody in particular to participate, but would anybody like to just give us their thoughts on that first question before we move forwards?
Yeah. Yes. Can I? In our country, whenever a kid is joining a class, and karate class or in the championship, we take paper sign from their parents if they're under 18, and even if they're plus 18, we take it from the parent and them, that they are aware of it, that maybe they will get hurt, and they know it all, and they're consenting that yes, they know, and they will do that. Like they will have no problem with that. Yes.
Lovely, thank you very much, Shimon. I'll talk about that practice as we move through the presentation. Absolutely. So the sort of formal written affirmation that you're aware of what's going on and that you're consenting to, to be part of that sport. Absolutely. Anybody else have any other thoughts on this?
Well, I think that, for example, in my club in Mauritius, before kids join my club, the parent has to give a consent, so that if ever there's any mishap, so the parents are aware that the taekwondo. In taekwondo, there do exist that the kids may get injured, so they take the responsibilities. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yeah, so the same sort of practice, yeah, the sort of formal form signing, and in both cases, it's parents as well as children that are involved, and that's quite an important factor, which I'll circle back to later on. Any other thoughts on this one before we move forwards? Okay, so we'll go forward then. So thank you guys for sharing this. So this is something that, as I say, I will come back to with this idea of formal written consent being a pretty important thing. Certainly, it's important in terms of the legal frameworks that we operate in. And I imagine that those of you who run schools, particularly where you work with young people, that you should be at least aware of the legal frameworks that you work within in your respective countries, whether that comes from the government or whether it comes from sports governing bodies, that there are formal frameworks that we have to operate within and guidelines to follow and procedures to make sure that they're in place. And that's really, really good. Very important aspect of this issue. But what I hope to highlight today is that it's a little bit more than that. The kind of things that go on in terms of the way people communicate consent are more than simply the written stuff. An important ingredient, but not the whole story. So very good, thank you very much. So let's carry on forwards with the presentation. So that's a broad bit of background in terms of my research, my interests, and what led us to this particular paper. So the next sort of question is, why study consent in combat sports? And I don't need to, I think, persuade you guys of this, given that you do combat sports, but it's important to sort of put this on the radar of folks who are interested in sport more generally, that when we're thinking about consent, there are a few sports where consent becomes more of an obvious problem and more of an important issue, legally as well as morally, than sports which involve punching and kicking, where people are engaged in actions which, outside of a sports context, would almost always be seen as illegitimate, immoral, illegal, and violent. So because combat sports involve the appearance of violence, they involve actions which seem violent, consent becomes very, very important in these contexts. And that gives us a really good opportunity as academics to understand what consent looks like in sport generally. But as I mentioned before, it also gives us a really good opportunity as instructors, as coaches, as people who work with young people to develop them morally and to help educate them in various different ways. It gives us a really great resource to use to teach them about what consent feels like. This is my love, fighting, hate, violence line, again, which I mentioned earlier, which I won't spend much time talking about now, but we can definitely talk about at the end if you guys would like to know more about it. So this is the sort of the idea of the pedagogy of consent, that we can teach about consent through combat sports practice because of its importance here. But otherwise, to sort of connect with the opening point of the lecture today, this idea of the violence problem, that people involved in martial arts, when I've confronted people in interviews with this problem, what do you think when people say that practicing martial arts is violence? Usually their response is something along the lines of, well, I'm not a violent person, or I don't think it's real violence. I think that there's something else going on here. Okay, it's not violent, or it's a different type of violence, etc., etc. So there's a lot of investment of, and I've put here on the slide, of identity work. I'm not a violent person. This is not my identity. I reject this label for myself. Because this is such an important aspect of being a martial artist and doing martial arts, consent becomes a really key sort of ingredient in terms of what makes martial artists do what they do and make it sort of construct this moral framework that they have. So I've put here on the slide that there's a higher stakes than normal, higher moral stakes than normal in other sports, like for instance football. Certainly there are actions which happen in football which might be considered to be violent assault if it wasn't happening in football. The sort of slide tackle where players collide with each other. But because that doesn't form the bulk of football, it doesn't form the normal actions of the sport, and it's not the express purpose of the sport isn't to collide with other bodies. The purpose of the sport is to score goals. It becomes perhaps less pronounced and less obvious. Whereas in judo, for instance, the express purpose of judo is to slam somebody on their back. The express purpose of boxing is to knock somebody unconscious. Okay, the express purpose in Taekwondo maybe isn't to score a knockout, but you can knock people out in Taekwondo for sure. You learn techniques that are certainly useful to that end, and still your express purpose is to physically dominate somebody and overcome them, to overcome their resistance and to defeat them in a ritualized fight. So because combat sports involve this kind of action, consent becomes really, really important, and studying consent in these contexts can be really rewarding for sociologists and psychologists who are interested in how consent works in practice. So my key points, and I've labored this a few times now, but I just want to sort of really emphasize this for you guys, because this is the crux of how I think about this. It's where the pedagogical intervention comes from. It's the key theory for underpinning about 10 years of my work. So I want to make sure that it's really, really clear. Consent is what makes the difference between what we've called violence, generally illegal and immoral, and for want of a better term, in this context, which we call fighting. So the things that happen in martial arts that are expected, that are celebrated, that are supposed to happen. Okay, so if we love fighting but hate violence, this is how that happens, because fighting is what we consent to, we want to do, and violence is not. Violence is that which happens outside of our consensual framework. So yes, because of this, martial arts can potentially be used as a vehicle for consent education. Because of its importance here, we have a good opportunity to use these actions, these activities, to teach young people. So again, I'm going over the same ground, but hopefully this is nice and clear for you all. So this now brings us to the actual paper. I did send this out to you beforehand. Again, apologies for the lateness of that. Brunwei, you've printed it off and you've made some notes, so that's great. Everybody else, you can have a look at it later if you haven't already. But this paper, I'll just say a little bit about the actual publication. Just a couple of days ago, actually, it was sort of published in print, but it's been published online for about 6 months now, I think. The study is, I won't say too much about the methods because I know that you're not a sort of primarily academic audience, but basically this is a kind of method called concatenated exploration, which is looking at previous research and revisiting previous research to sort of analyze it and look for patterns that we hadn't looked for before specifically. So we're looking at about 16 years worth of study. As I say, 8 distinctive projects that myself and Chris Matthews have been involved in, either together or separately or working with other colleagues. So it's a very large amount of data. It took us quite a long time to go through it all: interview transcripts, field notes, studies of media content and other observations that we've made throughout this course of practicing different martial arts ourselves, observing other people, interviewing them and so on. It took us a long time to go through all of that, but in the end, we came out with quite a lot of what we think is pretty powerful stuff that helps us to think about how martial artists actually communicate consent to each other. So again, don't need to say too much about the methods because it's not the right context, but if you want to read up in the paper, there's a bit more detail on what that method involves and how we actually did this research. The long and the short of it is there's quite a lot of data gathered over a long period of time in a lot of different martial arts contexts. So most of what we do is based around competitive combat sports, but some of the research that we've done here is on people who aren't competitors, they're not athletes, practicing disciplines that aren't necessarily competitive. Like for instance, there's some of the data from Aikido, for example, where practitioners are not generally competitive athletes. The majority of the data, though, is from sports like boxing, mixed martial arts, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and other sort of very competitively oriented martial arts. So the majority of what we're saying here is drawn from the sort of the competitive sport world of martial arts, not necessarily, the sort of self-defense world. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on the research that underpins the preceding or the following discussion. And again, at this point, I think we'll just sort of take a little brief interlude again to ask you guys for some thoughts. So I've talked a lot about my thinking on the relationship between consent and violence and martial arts practice. And I would invite at this point just to give us a little bit of a breather from me talking constantly for an hour and a half to ask you guys, what do you think about this? Have you, before today, before my monologue for the last half an hour and before looking at this research. Have you thought about this issue of consent and violence? Has this cropped up at all in your martial arts practice? Yeah, what do you think? So that second question on my sheet there, what are your thoughts and feelings on this topic? And again, I'll just open this to the floor.
Hello. Yeah. Actually, we in my case, we think about it to to let them know what they will be going through, because most of the time the kids, whenever they want to learn martial art, they watch it from the movie and they follow the hero, and they say that a hero is fighting everyone against them, and he's like a James Bond, and he's not getting hurt and everything. So they think that they will just kick away and punch away everyone, and they won't be getting hurt. And at the same time, they think that they will just have to kick and punch. They wouldn't have to do some physical work or like energy breathing and everything. So whenever we discuss it in the beginning, that maybe if it's 3 days class, 2 days will be martial art, and 1 day will be for the stamina, speed, and everything. There will be no kicking, punching. So if they think that, oh, why didn't they do any kick punch today? Why did so this is it. And it's even if you are the hero, and we believe that you are a hero or heroine, but you will get hurt, and it's not so you better should know that. And it's not that like from the Rocky movie that you will get hurt, you will get down, but prove you is that you'll stand up again and keep going, keep moving, and then prove that what you're made of. And so we discuss it about in the beginning, in the beginning session first. So this is like consent means to me and everything. And can I take just 1 minute? Thank you. And I'm taking, can I have a consent from you that I want to leave? Not that I want to, I have to. So can I?
Of course. And thank you for asking. That's very, very funny and very kind. And thank you as well for your participation. It's much appreciated.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone. It's been 5 days, and I wanted to take the last class so seriously and have some fun and everything, but you know, it's like you have to everything like and we have to go through, you know. And I would love to be with you. And thank you, Dr. Shannon, for interrupting and let me interrupt in your class. Okay. Thank you, and everyone. Have a nice day, and we'll be catching up maybe someday together. And Miss Sung-hye, you were wonderful.
Thank you, Julie. I hope you have a great presentations today.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. See you again.
Yeah.
I will let you leave the room.
Thank you.
Okay, lovely. So thank you very much. Any other thoughts on that one there?
Okay, Professor Alex, because I am a teacher in university, so since my students, they are like 20 years old, so they are more likely to control themselves. So they are not likely, so there are seldom very violent situations that have occurred in my class. But you know, in university, in addition to teaching them the martial arts skills, we need to help them to build very correct values. So we will use martial arts to teach them how to show courtesy to your team members, your classmates, and your opponents, coaches, and different personnel. So there are very little situation, violent situation that have occurred. But actually, you know, when I was reading your paper, and when I knew that the topic of your class today, actually I'm eager to know something about this, because in China there are very little scholars who have done such kind of research, because there are any academic research that is relevant to psychological issues, it is not very easy to handle, because it's too risky, because we are not we don't know how to make sure the results are very believable. So we do not do too much such kind of research. So that's why I want to know more about this. Okay, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Yes, thank you. And I think that's a very important question, sort of a scientific question, right? Around how can you trust these findings? So my methodological background, and I won't digress too much into this because it gets more sciencey and more technical, but my methodological sort of background here is in qualitative research. And of course, qualitative research is very different to quantitative, where we would generally, in quantitative research, we would want to control all the variables that we can and make sure that we are absolutely positive and absolutely certain that we've found the truth. The sort of truth with a capital T, the formal truth, objective truth of something. Whereas the kind of research that we need to do to understand human societies, and particularly human interaction, you often can't do that. It evades that kind of objectivity. That kind of truth is very, very difficult to find. So certainly in English speaking sociology and social psychology, we embrace qualitative methods as a way to, okay, we aren't finding out definite objective facts like you would in a science experiment in the laboratory. But that doesn't mean that the things we find can't be trusted at least a little bit. It doesn't mean that we can't find out things that are worth knowing about, even if they aren't definitively factual truths, if that makes sense. So yes, the research here is built on, mostly it's built on interviews, so qualitative interviews. And it's also built on observations, both participant observations, so me doing martial arts myself, learning about it through the practical aspect of doing it, but also watching other people. One of the studies that informs this research is a study on medical practitioners who work at combat sports events. So I went to fight competitions, boxing, mixed martial arts, kickboxing, and some others. And I sat next to doctors and nurses and paramedic staff who were providing emergency medical cover. So I got to sit next to these people while they watched. It was great. I got to sit right at the side of the ring for several really, really great events. And I got to see how they worked. So I observed them by being in this space. So methodologically, yes, it's not the sort of definitive truth that you would expect from a chemistry experiment, for instance, but it's still trustworthy in the qualitative paradigm, to the extent that, okay, it's not the truth, but it's a truth, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
So it's an epistemological debate, which we can probably have later if you want to keep talking about it, but that's the underpinnings here. This is subjective, it is interpretive. Other researchers would probably have seen or would probably have interpreted things slightly differently to us, but we're still confident in the things that we did, the things that we saw, the things that we heard. We can trust them enough to build a theory that helps us to think about what's going on here. Okay, thank you very much. Any other thoughts on that second question before we move forward? So, what do you think is the relationship between consent and violence? Why might this be important in martial arts? Did anybody want to sort of add anything? I know that I've talked for a long time about this. If there's any other thoughts or perhaps questions or maybe even critical observations at this point, I'm happy to hear them. But if not, then we can carry on. So this brings us to the sort of the main body of this presentation, which is what do we find? How is consent done? How is it practiced? How is it communicated in martial arts settings? And what we've ended up doing is building a 4-point typology, so 4 different categories, broad categories of how this takes place. We've already heard about the first one from a couple of you who've given us your practices, the way that you do consent involving the signing of forms, okay? And we'll talk a bit more about that in overt communication. But as well as overt communication, there's also subtle communication, so deliberate but less explicit forms of giving consent, which are generally recognized by people in martial arts, which might not be recognized by people outside of martial arts, almost like the idea of a secret handshake. You know, if you know what it means, then you know. And if you don't know what it means, then maybe you don't know. Maybe you don't really understand. Two ways in which consent is expressly communicated, but then two other ways that consent is worked out in martial arts. One, it's the assumption of consent, and the other is consent that is deferred to third parties. So I'll go through each of these in turn, and I'll exemplify them. I'll give you some examples from the studies that we've done that highlight them, and I'll also highlight a few problems, a few ways in which consent doesn't always work very well in these settings. So first of all then, overt communication. And in the top right, we've got there the text from a liability form. This is something that some competition organizers would require athletes to sign before they take part in the competition. So if you want to fight in this cage, then you need to sign this form. You know, if you want to fight in this boxing tournament, you need to sign that you're voluntarily assuming this, and that's fine. So this happens with some regularity in the United States. It's something that is a sort of formal legal requirement for athletic commissions to allow combat sports competitions to take place. In the United Kingdom, where I'm from, it's a lot less common. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Club membership agreements is what we've already heard about from a couple of you guys about your own practice, that young people are required to, or young, children's parents are required to sign forms, and perhaps the young people themselves to sign forms to say they understand what it is that we do here. You know, we're doing taekwondo, we're doing kickboxing, we're doing karate. You know, you might get hurt. We need to know that you're okay with that legally, and so on. So club membership agreements, this is far more common in the UK than the liability waivers at competitions. It's very common for people to sign a form when they start doing martial arts. But I'll say a bit more about how that can be slightly problematic in a moment. The other thing, I don't know how familiar you guys are with mixed martial arts, but these are a couple of examples from mixed martial arts here. The referee's question at the start of fights. And I think this is really interesting. You know, when we're watching combat sports competitions, certainly in full contact martial arts, but also in our Olympic disciplines of judo, taekwondo, we would usually see the referee at the start of the match saying, you know, are you ready? Are you ready? Okay, let's go. Okay, so the referee has this role to play that sort of, you know, makes sure there is a question that's publicly asked before the fight begins. And that's quite an important symbol. It's quite an important ritual that the referee is in control of this. The referee is making sure that it's happening the way that it should happen, which is consensually. But again, there's some problems with this, which I'll come back to. It is not necessarily a very strong way to communicate consent between people. From some of my own experiences, informed by my practices in karate and kickboxing, and then most recently Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is the martial art I train in now, discussions with coaches are quite common in terms of coaches would say to their students, you know, is anybody injured today? Okay, because if you're injured, then, you know, go easy, take it easy. And you guys probably do this, right? Now, you might not think of this as consent. This is more sort of safety and risk and so on. But actually, it is partly to do with consent, because if I've signed my membership form that says, you know, I'm happy to do taekwondo and I know what this involves, and I've done that, I signed that form maybe 3 years ago when I joined your club. Now, what we know from the research in the sociology of medicine and the sociology of sex is that consent isn't a once in a lifetime thing. It's not something you give once that applies forever. It's something that is ongoing. So if I consent to do something tonight with my partner sexually, that doesn't mean that I've consented to do that same thing all the time, always. Obviously, right? Consent is an ongoing thing. And that's the same in sports, right? So if I turn up to training on one day, I might have signed my consent form that says I'm generally happy with the idea of being punched. But if I turn up to training and I've got a concussion, or if I'm feeling rather unwell, or if I'm sick, then maybe I don't want to be punched today. Maybe it's actually better for me, for my safety, but also for my just general well-being, if I do something slightly differently today. So Coaches will have this moment where they ask their participants, are you injured? Are you well? If anybody is injured, let us know about it. That's usually what will be said. And I've seen this happen in lots of different contexts. Doesn't always happen, doesn't happen in every session, but it's enough of a normalized practice, both in my own practice of martial arts and also interviewing people about this. This is a fairly regular occurrence. It's a fairly good, good coaching practice to engage in, and it helps to set this ongoing mediation of consent. And it's overtly communicated. It's something that's talked about openly. There's also, with these discussions of coach and declarations of injury, there's also what often happens, well, certainly, again, in my experience as an adult doing martial arts, I think perhaps a little bit less so with children, is verbal negotiation between partners. So, for instance, one of the examples used in the paper is I suffered an injury in my neck a few years ago. It was quite serious. A spine disc in my spine had ruptured, and it's very painful and so on. And to rehab that, I'd done physiotherapy, and all of my friends in my training hall, they all knew about this. They knew that I had this injury. And quite often when I went back to training, they would ask me, and in fact, they still ask me every time, how's your neck? Is your neck okay? Are you all right? How are you feeling today? And so there is this constant verbal negotiation. It happens partly because of the context of the club that I'm in. It happens also because we know each other fairly well. They know that I've been injured. They're my friends. They're looking out for me. And there is this negotiation before we do any sparring. Do you want to go easy today? Is there anything that we should avoid? And this, again, is a fairly common practice in many combat sports activities where practitioners are perhaps a little bit older and they've started to take ownership over their own participation. So they've started to take a little bit of control. They don't only do what the coach tells them, they also moderate this between themselves with their partners. However, much as this happens with some regularity, it doesn't always happen. So one of the interviewees exemplifies this very well, a kickboxing coach who has had experience in various different martial arts. You can see here from this text, this is a British kickboxer, by the way, British martial artist. Not once in all my 31 years of experience competing have I ever signed a waiver or a consent form. So while this kind of practice might be fairly common in some countries where it's a legal requirement, like in the United States, in the UK, in other parts of Europe and other countries around the world, if it isn't a legal requirement for somebody to sign a form before they compete, then that doesn't necessarily happen. So the study that I did where I shadowed medical professionals, I saw it maybe twice in all of the events that I went to. And there was quite a few events that we went to. We didn't see it happening very often, that people were actually signing a declaration. When it comes to club membership agreements, do young people and their parents necessarily read them very carefully? Do they think about them in an ongoing basis? Is it always something that's at the forefront of their mind? Is it fair to say that if it's used once, 2 or 3 years ago, that it's always relevant forever? How regularly are these things checked up on and updated? With the referee's question at the start of a fight, as I sort of indicated with my gesturing, is it really a genuine question? Are you ready? Are you ready? I mean, it's performance, isn't it? It's something that gets the crowd excited. It's not really a genuine attempt to ask, do you really want to do this, right? There's the assumption, which I'll come back to later, that if you're here in this ring, if you're here in this space, then you must want to. So the question itself is not so meaningful. I have included a photograph here of that I took this other question here, this referee talking to this lady in the cage, where I did observe some referees quietly, while the crowd wasn't paying attention to that fighter, going over and just talking to them quietly. And I asked the referees, why do you do this? And they said to me, we just want to make sure, because we know that when everyone's watching, when the coach can hear what we're saying, we know that perhaps the athlete might not say what they really think. So I want to check, if you're really okay. And I want to let you know that if you're not okay, you can tell me. So sometimes this does happen, much more meaningful involvement by the referee, which is something we'll come back to later on in this presentation. But overall, I think the overt communication of consent, while it does happen in various different ways, there are numerous ways in which it could be assumed that this is not necessarily a perfect way to assure that people are consenting to what goes on in martial arts. How regularly do these kind of conversations happen? Do coaches always ask about injuries? Do coaches make it clear to their athletes that you are allowed to tell me if you're injured? That, you know, it doesn't mean that you're weak. You know, it doesn't mean that you are that you're being lazy if you're injured. Is this really clear? What kind of culture exists in this school, in this club, in this space that might make it more or less easy for somebody to say, you know, coach, I'm hurting today. You know, my neck hurts. Or I feel sick, and I don't think I can train at the same intensity. How much power do young people have, or any people have really, to actually give consent? Or how much is this sort of just a routine, just a performance? It's just a symbol. It doesn't have any real meaning. So I would say, you know, as coaches in your various different disciplines, you know, in different countries, in different martial arts styles, working in different federations and different schools, I would say this is something to really think about and reflect on. What kind of culture of consent exists in your space that makes it perhaps easier or more difficult for people to actively give or indeed withdraw their consent to train and to participate. So that's the first sort of set of observations. Overt communication, it does happen. Sometimes it happens very formally. Sometimes it happens a little bit more informally. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes it happens in ways that are not particularly meaningful. And this brings us into the second category, which is, in the study that we've done, the data that we've looked through seems to be more common and seems to be more widely practiced. And this is very much reminiscent of some of the research on sexual consent, where expressly saying, yes, I'm happy to do this with you, it is not particularly sexy. It's not something that people generally want to do before they engage in sex acts. They don't want to sort of sign a form that says, you know, exactly what they're interested in. It doesn't really happen that way. Even if people might think it's good practice, it doesn't necessarily happen. But what people do instead is they give each other little clues. They give each other little hints. They give gestures. You know, I won't do any of them because it's not appropriate, but you probably know what I mean. Subtle communication, body language, eye contact, saying things that have double meanings and so on. Now, in sports context, the same sort of practices exist. Certainly in martial arts, we have what's referred to here as conventionally recognized gestures. So my example on the slide there is from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This is something that if you didn't do Jiu-Jitsu, you probably wouldn't understand. But when people were going to spar together, they'll come to each other and then they slap their hands and then they bump their fists like this. It's what we do every time we do any kind of sparring. In boxing, we put our fists out and we just touch our fists like this. In other martial arts, maybe it's a bow. Martial arts have different ways of bowing that indicate different things between different contexts. So there are different symbols, different little ritualized performances that tell our partner, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to spar. I'm ready to do this practice. We also might do it when we enter the dojo for the first time or when we leave. So when we cross that threshold, I used to train in Kung Fu at university, and we would always do this Kung Fu bow of this, and then we would do that. And we would do this every time we went into the hall and every time we went out of the hall, not just to symbolize our respect for the martial art, but also to show to ourselves and to others that we understand that when we're in this space, in this place, this is where we do fighting. It's almost like I'm indicating to myself, okay, I'm entering the fighting space, and now I'm leaving the fighting space. So these gestures are very important. And again, I'm sure that this is something that you all in some capacity have some kind of experience with, depending on your particular style. And you might not have thought about it as consent, but it's one of those things that I think actually demonstrates our willingness to engage in the practice, which is consent, telling somebody that I'm ready to go. So in the context of jiu-jitsu, this is one of my interviewees told me, you know, this is how we know that it's go time. You know, it's time to start sparring. And we always spar quite hard in jiu-jitsu. It's a sport where you can spar fairly hard without worrying about knocking people unconscious. So If I know that you're ready, then we'll go for it. Equally, we have subtle communication of consent, ways of withdrawing consent. So again, from jiu-jitsu or from judo, from wrestling and mixed martial arts, the act of tapping somebody means, you know, stop, I'm done, I'm beaten, you've won. In boxing, you can take a knee. So if you drop down to one knee, that indicates that you are, you know, you want to stop the fight. And in other martial arts, there are other symbols as well, practice that we might engage in to visually and verbally, sorry, not verbally, but visually withdraw our consent. As well as these sort of ritual gestures, conventionally recognized ritualized gestures, there's also something that takes place, which I've referred to here as intensity negotiation. And this is something which happens between opponents or between, let's say, partners when we're sparring, where I might not be directly or clearly communicating this to my partner by saying anything to them or by giving them any symbols, but they can read my body language and they know that I'm probably not as excited as I usually am, or maybe I am, maybe I'm getting a little bit tired, maybe my heart isn't really in it today. And they can read that by watching how I move, by feeling my tempo of my body, and then responding in turn. So you can read the quote there from Carl, the boxer. The better you get at boxing, and the better you know who you're sparring, the better you get at knowing if they're all right or not. If you can pick up on the signs your partner is giving you, then you can take things up or down a gear. So basically what Carl is saying is that when I see that my partner is perhaps a little bit too tired today, when I see that they're not really their usual self, I'm not going to spar with them as hard as I normally would. So he reads this from the body of his partner. Again, it's not expressly communicated. It's not something that's being clearly asked of him, but it's being assumed, it's being read into what his opponent is doing, and he's adjusting his practice accordingly. Interestingly enough, about a week after I submitted this paper to be published, I then happened to read two papers that had come to me for peer review, which were exactly about this, about intensity negotiation in different martial arts. And it was really, really funny. And in a sense, this is what always happens in academia. The minute you publish something, you read something that would have really helped you to make your point. But there's some good research that's going on about this now, about this very sort of subtle embodied communication in martial arts. So on the left-hand side of the slide there are personally specific cues. So I know my partners, I know what they're like. I know if they're having a good day or a bad day, and I'm going to look after them. You know, I'm not here to injure anybody. I want to help my partners to get better. They help me to get better. So we're going to work together, and I'm going to, I'm not going to take advantage of their weakness. I'm going to make sure that they're okay. So while this isn't express giving and communicating of consent, it's still a process whereby if I want to ease up, I would maybe throw punches a little bit less hard. If I want things to go slower, I will move slower, and my partner will respond to that and will match my intensity. Likewise, if I want to go harder, I don't necessarily have to say to my partner, let's go hard. I just start punching harder. And if they start punching harder back, then maybe it's okay. But of course, there are problems with this as well. Again, our conventionally recognized gestures, our touching of gloves, our slapping and bumping, because we do it all the time, every single time we spar, every single time we compete, every time we enter the hall, is it still as meaningful as it ought to be? Or does it become a hollowed out, ritualized gesture that doesn't really carry meaning to us, doesn't hold that important meaning for us? With respect to intensity negotiation, am I sure that my partner's happy when I start pushing harder? If I start kicking her with more force and she starts kicking me harder back and I think, oh, this is great. Is it really great? Maybe she's feeling threatened. Maybe she's not happy, but I'm not talking to her. I'm just assuming, and I'm reading it from her body language, that she's happy. So I think it's fine, but maybe she doesn't. So there's a little bit, potentially a little bit of a breakdown here. If I'm not doing this in a way that's clear, if I don't perhaps know my partner very well, or Maybe I do know them well and I've got things wrong that one time. Maybe I'm not recognizing the cues correctly. Maybe I'm doing something that they're not happy with. Ultimately, this last point on the slide there, this subtle communication, this body language, intensity negotiation, it starts to rely on assumptions. Rather than direct communication, it relies on assumptions about what the other person is thinking and feeling. If we circle back a little bit to sexual consent, this is where things start to get problematic. If people aren't clearly, sure that what their partner is doing is good, and if they're not absolutely certain their partner's happy with it, then we start to get into dangerous territory. In medical consent, you would never assume that somebody is happy with the treatment that you're giving them as a medical practitioner. You would be in a lot of trouble legally if you were doing something that somebody didn't expressly consent to. So we're into slightly difficult territory here. A lot of sports practitioners, a lot of martial arts practitioners don't think this is a problem. Most of the time, maybe it isn't a problem. But once or twice, it might be. We might get moments where people are not happy. And this comes through in the literature quite well. Again, to touch on the gender example of this, one of my colleagues was a boxer who wrote about her experiences of boxing as a woman in a gym that was populated mostly by men. And she told us stories about how sometimes the men that she trained with would hit her really hard. If she started to beat them, if she started to sort of outmaneuver them and outscore them with her punches, they would start hitting her harder. And they felt perhaps that they were giving her good training by being intense and by being, she's a good level boxer, let's push this harder. But she experienced that in a different way. She experienced that as, well, they're trying to hurt me because I'm a woman who's better than them and they're intimidated, so they're trying to hurt me. So this assumption that this is a good thing without explicit communication can create some problems. This brings us through to the third category, the assumption of consent. Similar to subtle communication, across the entire data set that we looked at, all of the studies that we re-examined, the assumption of consent was the most consistent thing that we found. So people would often say, if you step into the ring, the boxing ring up there in the top right, if you step into the ring, that's enough for me to know that you're happy to do this. Because, we all know the rules, right? There are rule sets that are published by governing bodies. There are referees in place. There are judges here. We've trained in the sport. We know what the sport involves. So if you're here in the space that's designed for competition at the time that's appropriate for competition, then you must be happy. You must have consented. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. So there's this key assumption, and I use the English word volition, which broadly means voluntary, right? It's your choice to be here. You've made that choice. You could make a different choice if you wanted. You're here off your own volition, which underpins this. And again, most of the time, this is probably correct. Most of the time, athletes probably do have free will and they have chosen to be there. Maybe they're nervous. Maybe they're a little bit apprehensive. They're about to have a fight. It's scary, but they want to be there. Of course, that's not always going to be the case, which I'll come back to in a moment. The second picture I've put on there is a diagram that illustrates the different rule sets that are used in mixed martial arts competitions. All martial arts have their own rule sets. Some have multiple rule sets, depending on which federation you're a part of. So those of you who do Taekwondo will know about this very, very well, I think, about the difference between World Taekwondo and ITF, of course. Mixed martial arts, boxing, depending on where you are in the world, what federation you're a part of, the rules will be different, but the rules are there to tell us all what it is that we consent to. So if I'm fighting in a mixed martial arts competition, generally I'm expecting that my opponent will try to strangle me, my opponent will try to punch me, kick me, and so on. If I'm fighting in a judo competition, I certainly don't expect that my opponent will try to punch me. That's against the rules. So the rules give us a framework that we consent to. I can be fairly confident in my assumption that my partner or my opponent in a judo competition has consented to being thrown, but hasn't consented to being kicked, because those are the rules. Okay, we don't need to talk to each other about consent because the rules tell us what's there for consent. And again, this is a fairly common observation in most sports contexts and certainly in the martial arts. However, let me just bring all this up. As I mentioned before, this notion of volition and free choice, is a person's consent always freely chosen? Is a person always there expressly, freely, with their own agency, their own initiative? Sometimes we saw, particularly in youth sports, I saw examples where parents seemed to be a little bit more interested in their child's participation in the competition than the child seemed. There were medical staff that I spoke to who said that one of the problems they see quite often in combat sports is young people who don't want to fight, who don't seem to have the ability to take themselves out of that situation once they've arrived at the venue. So they arrive at the boxing venue, they've got their coach with them, they've got their parents with them, their friends, their teammates with them. They might have wanted to fight earlier that week, but when they're there and they're terrified and they don't want to fight anymore, they don't really have the option. Again, we're back to that sort of culture of consent. They don't really have the choice to withdraw their consent there. This is something that the medical professionals I spoke to were quite keen to tell me about, that they felt quite strongly about this, that as medical practitioners, this would be a huge problem for them in their professional practice. Whereas in sports contexts, it wasn't really seen as that much of a difficulty, which they found to be quite a problem. So can consent given in this way be easily withdrawn? Am I really sure that my partner, my opponent, is definitely happy with this if I've just assumed it based on their presence? And then lastly, what about the dynamic nature of consent? If I start competing in a sport and I get so far into my competition and I don't want to do it anymore, how empowered am I? How much agency do I have to take myself out of that context? How much cultural sort of permission is there for me to withdraw consent? And I'm saying this in the context of quite negative reactions to combat athletes who submit or submission is one thing, but I don't know how familiar you guys are with boxing, but there is a tradition in boxing where you could quit on your stool, which means between rounds, you say, oh, I'm losing this fight. I've had enough. I don't want any more. I'm going to stop fighting now. And that is generally looked at by people in the boxing milieu, by people who do boxing and watch boxing as quite a bad thing to do. There's quite a lack of moral character, that you didn't go out fighting. You didn't try your hardest. You quit. And that has quite negative connotations. So again, this comes back to this problem of the culture of sports and how much power people have to withdraw consent. And is it fair then for me as a practitioner of martial arts to always assume that my partner, my opponent, is definitely happy with what they're doing without actually hearing them say it? So the last category, and I appreciate I've been talking for a long time, so I do apologize, and we are a little bit over time already, so I'll try not to spend too much longer on this. But the final category is one where, and this sort of cuts across all of the categories so far, really, but this idea of deferred consent. And there's a couple of quotes here on the slides for you guys to have a little look at. Firstly, in the top right, from Jensen, a boxing coach. So you've got to push them past what they're comfortable with sometimes. So he's talking about the young people that he trains. You've got to push them out of their comfort zones, especially if they're getting ready for a fight, for a competition. So what he's saying here is that if a young person doesn't, or says they don't want to do something, or indicates their body language suggests they don't want to spar very hard, they don't want to work that hard tonight, they're not very comfortable, sometimes you just have to make them, because otherwise they won't be ready for the fires of competition. So it's my prerogative as the coach to push somebody beyond what they're happy with doing. And I'm sure that there's moments perhaps in your own coaching practice, or maybe other coaches that you've worked with, where what might be seen as quite a good practice of exposing young people to challenges and giving them opportunities to grow and to develop crosses over into forcing young people to do things that perhaps they don't want to do. And this is definitely a problem in sports regulation right now around How do we define appropriate coaching practices when it comes to pushing people outside of their comfort zones? So this happens quite a lot. It's certainly in full contact fighting sports, where coaches assume the authority to dictate to young people, or to all people really, what it is they do and don't consent to. And then down the bottom there, a different one. So this isn't about coaches so much, but it's about referees. There is an unwritten rule. If you're getting swarmed, which means if someone's on top of you and punching you, you might give up your back, get the choke on me or whatever. So it's basically up to the referee to stop it. So this is from an MMA fighter who's saying, I don't want to submit to my opponent. The last line here, you don't want the reputation that comes from tapping to strikes. So what Damon is saying there is that I don't want to submit and get a reputation as somebody who submits, a reputation as somebody who quits. I would rather the referee stops the fight for me. So in other words, Damon is deferring consent to the referee. It's up to the referee to make the decision about when I've had enough. And again, this is fairly common in the full contact mixed martial arts, boxing, kickboxing kind of sports, where the referee assumes the authority to say when the fight is finished, when the other fighter has had enough. So much so that some fighters will refuse to withdraw consent, even when they know they've had enough, even when they want out of there, they don't want to continue fighting. They'll just let the referee do it, or they'll let their coach throw in the towel. So referees often, I interviewed quite a few referees in another study, and they told me that quite often fighters are too tough for their own good. You know, they don't know when to quit, or they won't quit. So we have to quit for them. It's up to me, the referee, to be that person's self-interest, to be that person's conscience, if you like, and to quit on their behalf. So yeah, the last point there, deferred consent is still taken to provide moral absolution for athletes. So if I'm beating my opponent, and this is something that certainly in the full contact sports is probably more of an issue. If I'm beating my opponent very badly, I might recognize this. And if we go back a few slides to the subtle communication of consent, my sparring partner is going slow. My sparring partner is giving me signs that they're not happy. So I'm going to look after them. I'm not going to hit them too hard. In a competition, my opponent is going slow. My opponent is giving me signs that they're not happy. Well, I'm going to hit them as hard as I possibly can because I want to win. I'm going to exploit their weakness and damage them, because it's not my responsibility to withdraw consent for them. I don't have to look after them because the referee is looking after them. Their coach is looking after them, right? So there's this idea that there's a third party who is responsible for the morality of our exchange. Now, sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that works out perfectly well. The coach recognizes the fighter's too tough for his own good. I'm going to throw the towel in, stop the fight. The coach has withdrawn consent. Great. Maybe the coach doesn't believe that it's over. Maybe the coach thinks that his fighter just needs a talking to, and he'll come back and he'll be able to win. And the coach wants to win. So maybe the coach doesn't withdraw consent for this person that's too tough for their own good. Maybe the referee is incompetent and doesn't recognize that the fight should be stopped. Maybe the referee isn't very savvy, doesn't understand the sport very well. I witnessed a few times in my observation of medical staff, referees failing to recognize that fighters had been knocked unconscious, so that fights continued while somebody was lying on the ground, passed out. They were continuing to receive punches to the head, or they were continuing to be choked, even though they had already lost the fight. So deferring consent to other people is dangerous because they don't always act in our interests. They don't always act in ways that are competent. They don't always have our best interests at heart, and they're not always able to protect us. Also, when it comes to training environments, is it entirely clear how far my deferral of consent to the coach goes? So the coach might push me out of my comfort zone, and I might be happy for that in the long run because I grow and I get better. But maybe the coach feels that they can push me so far out of my comfort zone that I'm actually placed at risk. Some coaches might, for instance, feel that the best way for a young person to learn about martial arts is to learn the hard way, right? To learn by being beaten. maybe they take that to the extent that people end up feeling like perhaps they're being bullied, or perhaps there's an abusive culture that takes place in the sport. So is it clear exactly how much consent is deferred and how much agency is retained? So how much of my own power, my own free will that I hold on to once I've started to defer consent to coaches or to referees? So those are the four main sort of broad categories, and I've outlined what they involve, how they work correctly sometimes, but also some of the problems that they represent, some of the ways they can break down and not be particularly important or effective ways of ensuring that people are giving consent. So I've been talking for ages, and I do apologize. I've almost worn my voice raw by talking for about 40 minutes non-stop there. But at this point, I think perhaps we'll just sort of go back to the questions again, and come to perhaps the fourth and fifth questions here, in terms of what happens in your own martial art contexts. How does your role sort of shape how consent is given, how consent is done? And after going through all of these different findings from the study, what are your thoughts on how coaches can act to make consent perhaps more effective, to make consent more clear, and perhaps to empower young people and athletes to have a stronger understanding, pardon me, of what it means to consent in sports contexts? So again, I'll stop talking now, and I'll just open it up to you guys to chip in with your thoughts.
Can I go first? It's just a question. I would like to hear your opinion. And first of all, thank you very much for this long lectures. Really appreciate your great lecture. And you already mentioned in the deferred consent about the young children with their coaches, and applying those in the reality, or like classes for martial arts, for example, Taekwondo. So sometimes the youth, when they have to learn Taekwondo or other martial art, they should go on more level, even though they don't disagree, they don't agree to do some practices. So what do you think of that? What should the coach should they convince them, or what do you think they should do to encourage those youth, even though they are not they disagree to go to do more of the martial arts?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and thank you for raising it. And it's something that actually I think this question came up when I presented at ICM in 2018,
yes.
a similar kind of question. So yeah, the idea that to progress and to develop, you need to do more. You need to be pushed. You know, to learn what it's like to be a competitive fighter, you need to be hit. You know, and it's uncomfortable and it can be quite scary, particularly for younger people. You know, this is something that they wouldn't necessarily do unless somebody else had created that situation for them to be in. So, and this is a really important problem now, I think, for coach education in all sports, not just martial arts. It's certainly very obviously important in martial arts because we're punching and kicking each other, but in all sports that involve strong, hard effort, exhaustion, you know, working hard and taking risks and so on. In the UK, we have a lot of issues around this with respect to, well, currently, I think British gymnastics is going through, you know, a problem with allegations of bullying and abuse in coaching, where the coaches have taken this principle that, you know, young people must be pushed, they're lazy, and they won't get better, they won't improve, and they won't win any medals unless we push them further than they want to go. And while that principle might be correct in some circumstances and to certain extents, they've taken that to such a degree that they are psychologically abusing young people, and they're pushing their bodies to dangerous extremes. They are, you know, this isn't just British gymnastics, but this is in a lot of sports where body weight is important. Young athletes are being shamed about eating food. So they're developing eating disorders to keep their bodies small and light to, to do the maneuvers that they need to do. So there's clearly a problem, and there's clearly a line that exists between positive pushing of people beyond their comfort zone and developing them by pressing them to improve, versus dangerous, intimidating, risky and damaging practices. And I think for any different sports context, and particularly in the martial arts, it's going to be important to understand where that line is as a coach. And knowing the young people that you work with, knowing their ages, perhaps gender is also going to be a factor here. Cultural background is probably going to be a factor. Their previous experience in sports is likely to be important. Knowing who those people are. And this is, I think, why it's so important that a couple of you mentioned, signing forms at the start of practice, that you understand that this is going to involve working hard. You understand it's going to involve sometimes being hit. Are you aware of this? Do you know this? And making sure that people are actually informed about the consent that they're given, and making sure that consent is secured on a rolling basis. So it's not just sort of once, you've signed your life away and you're mine now, I can do what I want with you as your coach. That's not how it works. That's not how it should work. It should be an ongoing process of communicating with young people about what it is that you want to do with them and why it is you want to get there. Now, for more practical advice on this, I think that, and this is perhaps an age group issue. So younger children, it's not likely to be that effective, but working with their parents, perhaps having, semi-regular meetings with practitioners, with your students, with your junior coaches, and talking about these issues, talking about this, about, if we want to take things to the next level, are you prepared to work harder? Are you prepared to come in, earlier for training? Are you happier with doing a little bit more hard sparring? Even if you don't want to sometimes, do you want me to push you? Do you want to get better? Because if I push you, then you'll get better. And having those kind of conversations is at least part of the solution, I think, rather than just having this culture where the coach is the authority and everything the coach says is always, always going to happen. And you as a student have no power. I think that's the situation we want to avoid. We want young people to feel like they have some power in these arrangements. If they want to stop, they can. If they want to go easier, they have to say so, but they can. And ultimately, they're part of the discussion that builds into why we work hard, why we train and spar, with intensity. They at least have an ability to be part of that they're creating that culture. So yeah, I think that's a long-winded answer, but I think it comes down to that, making sure that they have at least some involvement and some power in that process, rather than having all the authority in the hands of the coaches.
Thank you.
Okay, any other sort of thoughts or observations or questions at this point?
Okay, I think thank you for a question about the role the coach plays on the issue of consent in competition. And from my personal experience of teaching, I think there are three things coach can do, or the role they play in competition. I think the first one is that because a few minutes ago, you have mentioned that in competition, sometimes it's more like an assumption. They are not sure whether the signs are correct. You have mentioned that because they cannot hear it very very sure about that. So I think at this time, the coach, they can make everything very clear, because for example, when there is a competition, the coach can ask whether if one side get injured, they can ask whether you want the competition go on or just quit. So that is the first thing the coach can do, is to make everything really clear. And I think the second thing the coach can do is that actually coach, they can give a deterrent function. because if there is a coach or referee or something else like the audience and the camera, it is a kind of deterrent function, right? And the next function the coach can do is that I'm sorry, somebody is calling me outside, so I'll quit.
No problem, no problem. Yeah, we'll just give a second, because there's some good points there, and I want to respond to them.
Well, one thing I wanted to add up is that the coach, I think that he should have the empathy to understand the participant. So whenever the students are feeling that they are not able to go beyond their limit, so the coach should stop and should not force them. Otherwise, there can be create a feeling that the student, the participant, won't come back again for the training. So in a way, it can be a way to demotivate the participant to come for training. So I think it is very essential for the coach to know the limits of the student, because, for example, if you're working with students of the age of 8 to 9, and you're working with students of 15 to 17, the training can't be the same. If you're trying to apply the same training for both those participants, it can, for example, you may force the kids to go beyond their limits. And in this, consequently, they can stop coming for training. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point, that I think a lot of coaches perhaps overlook this when they're thinking about, well, I want my to be the best they can be. I want them to be as strong and as powerful and as competitively successful as possible. So I must push them really, really hard. But of course, yeah, if they don't like it, then they'll stop coming, right? And if you're running a club, particularly if you're running a commercial business, you need young people to come, right? Otherwise, you won't have anyone to train, and you won't have a club to run. So I think it's a very important point, from coaches' self-interest more than anything else, that initial sort of stage before you get to the ethics of all of this, and your role as an educator to develop young people positively and all of the rest of it, which is fantastic. But yeah, absolutely, coaches need to look after their membership to make sure that their club is running well. And another point that you make there as well is the age differentiation, and I think that's another vital issue. I can only really speak to the UK context here, because I haven't researched coach education in any other context. But generally speaking, in the martial arts, we don't have very good governance in the UK. We don't have a governing body that really does much to oversee a lot of the martial arts practice. Certainly in the more sort of traditional Asian martial arts, they're very much self-regulating. And a part of that is, if you've got a black belt in some martial arts, then you're a coach. So I have a black belt in Kung Fu from my time at university, when I had no education in being a coach whatsoever. But in my organization, I could walk into a club. Exactly, I could train young people, and I don't know the first thing. I could know nothing at all about what's appropriate for a 7-year-old. Well, for me, what we did is loads of stance work, and then we did sparring. So I'll do that with my 7-year-olds. I'll exhaust them and then make them punch each other. It's terrible. So we don't have this really, really well-developed understanding of proper differentiation for ages. It's a slightly different issue than the consent one, but it's such a vital one, and I'm really glad you raised it, that sensitivity towards the different needs of different groups. Ronwee, we can come back to you, I think. So did you have a third point that you wanted to make a minute ago?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, my neighbor was calling me. Well, no more. I just have actually. There were 3 points I want to share, but when I was talking, I think the first 2 points are more important. So no more. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. So yeah, there's a lot to sort of unpick here and to think about with our own practices and also thinking sort of more widely around the roles that coaches play in helping to clarify what it is that we're doing here, why we're doing it, to be sure that participants are happy to do these things for these reasons and to work towards these goals. And your first point was to do with information, right? Do you know what it is that you're consenting to? Do you know what these symbols mean, what these gestures mean? Do you understand what's going to happen? And being really clear about this. And again, in other areas of research on consent, certainly in academic consent, research consent, it's really important for our participants to know what it is they consent to. Nobody would take part in a science experiment if they weren't, well, they shouldn't do, if they weren't first told what it is that they're going to be asked to do. In medicine as well, you get talked through by the surgeon every single thing that they're going to do with you, and these are the side effects, this is the potential complication, this is the chance that it will happen, this is the prognosis. They tell you everything. You have to be informed by what you consent to. So why shouldn't the same principle apply in sports, where we're taking risks with our bodies, we're doing things that might end up with long-term health problems? We're becoming a lot more aware now of the impact of concussion in contact sports, certainly in the combat sports. Do young people really understand? Do teenagers really understand that if they're going to be doing full contact fighting, that they might get brain damage? Do they really grasp that? Is it really that? Is it understood in a way that they can make an informed decision about this? So I think there's a lot of questions moving forwards, certainly for the full contact martial arts, around proper understanding of the long-term health implications of competing in competing at high level in these kind of sports, which coaches, I think, will play an important role in. Governing bodies as well, I think, have an important role to play in that. Okay, any more questions for me, guys? Any more observations or thoughts on the question sheet that I sent to you? Happy to hear anything and respond.
Excuse me. I'm wondering, is this next section for today's class, or I have another chance to raise any questions later?
Oh, I'm happy for you to send me an email with any questions, or if you wanted to chat later, that's fine as well, no problem.
Oh, so that is almost the ending of this class, right? Okay, so can I ask one more question?
Sure.
When you are talking about violence, there is a term, it is called violence athletics. I make sure how to pronounce violence aesthetics. That is a new term. So when we are talking about violence, I think violence is inevitable especially in competitions, and sometimes violence is not that so bad, because in a competition, sometimes violence often attract much attention from the audience. So it is very attractive for the audience and for the media. So violence is not a bad term, and people raise the new term of the violence athletics. So I want to know, do you have any opinions on this? Thank you.
Absolutely, and I could happily talk about that all day with you. So I'll try and give a concise answer. So yeah, in my work, we've generally tended to use the term violence to refer to things that are socially stigmatized, so things that are generally thought of as bad things. That's not to say that's the only way we can use the term. and I think, you know, what you mentioned, the violent aesthetics, so the appearance of violence, the symbols of violence, the representation of violence. Strangely, we, as much as we abhor violence in real life, we feel attracted to and enthralled by violence in fiction and in fantasy. We play video games where we murder people. You know, we watch movies where people blow things up and fight all the time. And then, of course, we engage in sports that involve actions that are the same actions as those violent things that we don't like and that we would send people to prison for. So there is certainly an attraction to violence in the sense that it's exciting and it's enthralling. And you're absolutely correct that the dramatic, sort of brutal action of combat sports is a big draw for spectators. And there's some good research on this, actually, that it's not the only thing that spectators want to see, but it certainly draws spectators to full contact combat sports in particular. So there's scope, I think, as academics to think about the socially valued forms of violence, let's say, as distinct from the socially stigmatized ones. The reason that I have fairly consistently framed violence as a negative thing and something that is oppositional to the good actions of martial arts, to be very simplistic, is because of the Love Fighting, Hate Violence project, where language is necessarily simplified for the sake of pedagogy, for the sake of coaching and teaching. Academically, of course, it's more complicated than all of that. I did publish something. In fact, I can probably send you. I can send you guys. I'll send it to ICM, and you guys can distribute it through the mailing list. But I wrote something that helps us to understand how practitioners of so this is about mixed martial arts in particular. Practitioners of MMA engage in this very brutal combat sport in a way that is psychologically rewarding for them. They enjoy it in a way that is exciting for spectators, and in a way that generates revenue and so on. And the way that they think about this as a form of mutually constructing risk for each other. So they collectively create a risk that they overcome. So they don't necessarily see it as a form of violence, they see it as a form of risk-taking, which they enjoy, which makes them feel powerful and makes them feel like they're brave and competent actors by engaging in this kind of risk-taking. So I can send you that to have a look at, as well as a paper that was written by a colleague of mine a few years ago, which is around the aesthetic judgment of violence in mixed martial arts, which I think you'll find quite interesting based on your question.
Thank you.
Yes, I have one more question. Since you're talking about violence in some types of martial art combat, is there any study to suit athlete afterwards? That means after years of doing violent combat competitions, I may say. Is there any study which shows what happened to them? Is it they come back to normal life again after competitions? Thank you.
Do you mean in terms of so people who do combat sports
when they are involved in combat training? What happened to the cycle afterwards? After years, when they have stopped training, is there any study?
In terms of the question of violence, I'm not sure, to be honest. There's certainly research on the long-term health impacts of participation in combat sports. There's a growing body of literature in sports science and sport medicine around, particularly around brain damage and other forms of chronic injury in boxing and other martial arts. There's some research I'm aware of that looks at the sort of developmental impact of martial arts training on young people, but not combat athletes as such. If you send me an email, I'll have a look later on, and I'll try and send you some stuff that might match with what you're interested in. There's quite a lot of research on these topics, but I'll have a search. If you can email me, and I'll dig something up for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. Okay, guys, we're almost out of time. I think we've got 15 minutes left on the Zoom meeting, but yeah, if anyone's got one or two more questions, I'm happy to field them. Otherwise, we can wrap things up. Okay, so if that's all, then I'd just like to once again thank you for having me along. Sung-hee, thank you very much for facilitating this.
Thank you.
It's been lovely to be part of the MARI
Thank
program.
you to you, sir, for discussing all these lectures to us to clear our doubts. Thank you very much.
Lovely. So yeah, just before I hand back to Sung-hee, just to let you all know, if you would like to get in touch with me at all about this project, this topic, or any of my other research on this theme and others, then I'm more than happy to. If you just pop me an email, you'll have my email address, I think, so you can get in touch with me. I'm happy to send you research papers or just have a little conversation as well. That's totally fine. So yeah, thank you, and good luck with all of your papers you have to write now for MARI, and of course for your work in the martial arts and beyond. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. CHANNON. You made our last lecture very special, and I will let the participants know your email, and maybe you could also keep in touch. Okay, all right. Thank you for sharing your time. It's almost 1 hour and 40 minutes over, but it was really interesting. And I know that it's quite uncharted area, but I think it's really lucky for us to have your lectures. And so, yeah, we will let you leave the room. And thank you everyone for participating in this lecture for last 5 classes. So yes, we will keep in touch. And yes, so this would be the.
In fact, if I could just add one more thing that I forgot to mention. I mentioned the Love Fighting Hate Violence project a couple of times. If any of you would like to have a look at it, I've just put the link here in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So you can have a look at the website. So it's lfhv.org, Love Fighting Hate Violence. On the website, we actually have an electronic copy of our coaching toolkit, which is a series of activities we've developed to basically help coaches to teach about consent using martial arts activities. So please feel free to download a copy, have a little look at it, use it if you want, or adapt it to your practice. Be very happy to hear if you want to do that. But it's totally free, so it's all there for you to have a look at. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
I hope you have a great day, Dr. CHANNON.
Thank you. You too.
Yes. Thank you.
Miss Hong, hello.
Oh, yes.
I have a question about the reports. Can I ask now?
Oh, yes.
We're going to read the report next month.